morning, everyone. This is still week 1 of Introductory Biology, Bio1153 at the University of the Southwest. I am, of course, Dr. Hendon, and today we're going to learn about the ecological interactions among organisms. In today's lecture, we're going to use termites, and we're going to look at how they survive and interact at both the population and community level in order to make them a very successful species and to be able to reproduce successfully. We will also be looking at the interactions between living and non-living things within the environment at different scales. One of the other things we're going to cover today is different ways that populations interact in communities and ecosystems. And we'll also be describing how the sun's energy is channeled through the living world. Finally, we will summarize interactions in social groups and see how they enhance fitness of a population. Of course, through that, we're going to be defining fitness. So let's start off with termites. Termites are insects that live in giant societies, and they tend to do a lot of damage to our homes and buildings if they get inside, because they're going to just destroy the wood. Termites are really neat because there's 3 main different types of termites that you're going to find within one colony. You're going to have worker termites, and these are the most destructive. They're the ones that are actually going to be eating through the wood and creating all the different tunnels and all that kind of stuff. The worker termites actually have bacteria in their gut, much like humans do. And this bacteria that's found in their stomach and digestive system is really neat because it allows the termites to be able to digest cellulose. Without this bacteria, the termites wouldn't be able to get any nutritional benefit from all of the wood that they eat. And so they have what we call a mutualistic interaction with the bacteria, and that's because both the bacteria and the termites benefit from this interaction between the 2 species. And so the termites get benefits from having the bacteria because they're being provided with a food source in the form of that broken down cellulose that the bacteria breaks down. And then the bacteria is also benefiting from this relationship because they have a place to live, they're being provided with food, all those kinds of things. When you also look at termite colonies, you're going to find different termites. You've got soldier termites and you've got the queen. And the worker, soldier, and queen termites are each very different on a physiological level, and they all work together to enhance the termite colony as a whole. So the soldier termites are obviously acting in a defense mechanism and they're protecting everybody, while the queen is laying eggs and doing the reproduction. And so termites have very interesting interactions amongst themselves and amongst other things within their termite colony. So here's a couple of pictures to give you an idea of what the termites look like and what they do. The picture here on your left, bottom left here, is a termite mound that is in a forest and looks like might have once upon a time been a tree or something like that. Termite mounds can get gigantic. There's some in like rainforests and stuff that can actually be seen from space. They are so big. And then our picture on the right is obviously a rotted, termite infested old cabin in the woods that's being taken back by nature. And so termites are really important in getting rid and breaking down wood and stuff and allowing nature to retake hold of those abandoned things. Today we have several videos in this chapter. I am posting them separately, so definitely look at them along the way and watch them. They're not playing correctly on my computer whenever we do this. So now we're going to look at how organisms act at different scales or different levels. And scales can be like a one-on-one interaction or a one inside one interaction like our termite. A one-on-one interaction would be similar to our cow in our picture here on this slide. He And that little bird's called a cattle egret. They have a mutualistic relationship, kind of like the termite and the bacteria. So the cattle egret typically lives in close proximity to cattle, and the reason for that is because they eat ticks and fleas and other parasites that are found on the cattle. And that's their main food source. And so you're going to typically find these little birds flying around or sitting on the back of a cow, and they're just picking off the fleas and the ticks and ridding that cow of parasites. This is obviously a good thing for the cow because ticks and fleas are itchy and they don't have hands or anything good for scratching unless they've got a scratching post nearby. But this is also good for the bird because the bird is also getting food and stuff from the cow. And so that is a one-on-one interaction. We can look at them that closely. We can also look at interactions amongst a population and like their social behaviors and how they interact with one another and what the grouping mechanism is like. A lot of animals do exhibit social behaviors such as a flock of birds, but you could also see a pack of wolves or a pride of lions. And then you also have those solitary animals that are going to fight for space. And there's reasons and benefits to both types of behaviors. And so it's really interesting as a biologist or an ecologist to study those kinds of things. So looking at main kinds of interactions that animals can have amongst one another. They can compete. You're going to have various different types of feeding relationships. And this can be predator-prey or, some sort of predator killing the prey, eating what they want, and then leaving the scraps for scavengers to come in, those kind of things. There's also symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationships. So symbiosis and mutualism is very similar. In mutualism, you're going to be each benefiting, and in symbiosis, you're also both going to be benefiting. The other kinds of relationships that we'll get into later on is going to be commensalism, and that's where one species benefits and the other is not helped or harmed. And the other thing is like parasitism, and that's where one is helped and the other one is harmed, but typically not killed, although that can happen eventually. So when we look at organisms, we want to define a few important terms, and one of those is going to be a population. And so a population is a group of the same kind of organism living in the same area. And then we can define the area in various different ways. The area could be as small as a classroom full of people or a house full of people. That could be the population of your house or your classroom, to that of your city, bigger even to your state or country. And then finally, we can look at the population on the entire planet. Studies are typically done in ecology on population. A lot of times we want to monitor size, and this is really important when we look at conservation efforts. Certain species, especially those that are threatened or endangered in an area or across the world, they are actually going to be constantly having their numbers monitored, because if you only have a few or handful of species of individuals left within a population, you can definitely start to see where just the birth of one or the death of one is going to make a huge impact on that population as a whole. Also, populations can get too big for an area, and that's important because that will define your carrying capacity. How much can one environment, how many individuals can one environment hold of a certain population? That's going to be your carrying capacity. And so our carrying capacity is typically going to be defined by a couple of important things, and these are called resource limitations. And so the biggie on resource limitations is food and water, but there are also other resource limitations like the presence of suitable mates or places to live and sleep and stuff to define the proper nesting environment, etc. And then how the environment changes over time, that's going to affect and change that population size. If it's really cold, you're going to have some older or sick individuals probably die off during the winter. Populations are then going to increase in the spring and summer as we start having breeding seasons and we have new births happening. And depending on if it's a drought year or not a drought year, if it's a drought year, there's not going to be as many green things, so herbivore populations are going to decline. If it's a wet year, we may have herbivore populations increasing a lot, and then that's going to cause the increase of the predator population, and then the predators increase and they eat all the prey, and so now the prey population is lower again. So it's constantly oscillating throughout the year and then from year to year based on how those things are changing in the environment. And so that helps us to define our carrying capacity. So the other important term we want to look at is a community. And so a community is a collection of populations of different species living in the same area. And so a lot of times we think of like our community being like all the people living in an area, but biology defines that as all the different kinds of species living in an area. And we have a really good picture here to help with that understanding, where we have the forest ecosystem pictured, and within that forest ecosystem we're going to find raccoons and deer and worms and fungi and trees and grasses and other kinds of plants and birds, and all of those things are living together, and that's going to create the community. So it's not just the animals, but it's the animals, the plants, the parasites, the bugs, everything. So I want you to think about like what is in your community. So right now I'm on campus here in Hobbs at the University of the Southwest. So if I'm thinking about what's in my community, there are people. There are quite a few spiders around. I've seen way too many tarantulas lately. There's definitely some prairie dogs. There's some very sad-looking grass and a very healthy population of stickers. There are a few scattered trees, and there are different species. Even amongst them, we have oak trees, and we have pine trees, and we have willow trees. I'm trying to think. I don't know what other kinds of trees we have because I'm not looking out a window at the moment. But then we've got some wildflowers, and we've got some birds, and I saw some squirrels and rabbits this morning. And so all of those things are coming together to create the community that is at the University of the Southwest. And so when we do research on that, we want to look at different things such as how many different species live in that area. And that is actually considered species diversity. And so we can actually count how many species there are in an area. And so that's quantitative because it actually has a number with it. And so in science, you have both quantitative and qualitative measurements. So quantitative is anything that can be measured and represented as a number of some sort, whether that's length or mass or anything like that. Qualitative is the other form, and that is where you're being descriptive. So qualitative studies are going to involve like colors and descriptions and those kinds of things. There's a little bit different. So when we look at species diversity, typically we want to know how many different species there are, but then we also want to know how many of each species there are living in a specific area. And scientists have actually figured out that, places that are wet and warm are going to have a lot more species than a desert. And so tropical rainforests are going to have very high species diversity because there are all sorts of creatures and animals and plants and all those kinds of things living in those areas. And deserts are going to have a lower species diversity. The more diverse a environment is, the more likely there are animals, plants, etc. that we haven't even discovered yet. And a lot of times you end up having really, really neat different things living in an area that's highly, highly diverse. And they have a very, very well-defined niche. And if we remember that from our last lecture, that's their place that they succeed and they do the best. And so it's really important to preserve those high species diversity areas. Okay, next thing we're going to look at is interactions between living communities and the physical environment. And we call these things ecosystem interactions, sorry. The first example we're going to look at here is with mangrove trees. So mangrove trees are really cool. They each have a very specific niche, each different species of mangrove tree, and they're going to interact with their environment differently. Mangroves typically are only going to be found around estuaries and those zones where you have oceans and land coming together, and there's a reason for that. So if we look here at your red mangrove trees are physiologically designed with their root system to be able to breathe and stuff even when submerged in water. So the red mangrove tree is going to be found at the furthest out into your water area, and that's because they can actually thrive and survive being underwater or having their root system underwater almost all day, every day. The black mangrove tree is a little bit different. It does need a little bit of time without being completely covered in water. And the reason for that, if you look at the little things that are sticking up above the mid-tide thing, that's actually how tall the little extensions from the roots, and you really don't need to know what that is for this class because this is introductory biology. That's where the black mangrove tree is able to have those root extensions extend above the water line and allow the tree to breathe. And so the black mangrove tree is going to exist a little bit closer to shore so that at high tide, the roots are still able to breathe in those trees. The white mangrove tree is going to be the closest of the mangroves that are going to be found to shore. And the reason for this is it's not going to breathe as well being submerged in the water. And so its roots mass is, there, and it's propping that tree up mostly out of the water, but it really only needs to be covered at high tide. And you can see there at mid tide and low tide throughout the day, those roots are going to be completely open to the air and not covered in water. And then we see buttonwood trees, which we're only going to find on land because they don't have the ability to be submerged in water without drowning. This transition from terrestrial to an ocean habitat, this is known as a transition zone. This is where you're going to see very specific things living in very specific areas amongst that transition, and it can change very, very rapidly. It's kind of cool to see. The other big transition zone that you'll see on Earth is whenever you're going up a mountain. And so at the bottom of the mountain, you've got lots of grasses, and then as you start to go up a mountain, you're going to see trees change. And that we saw on our Chapter 4 lecture, where we saw spruces and firs and pines at different elevations, and then you hit the tree line, and then above that there was just a few sparse bushes, and then eventually nothing. So that's another place where you're going to see a transition zone. So mangrove ecosystems are very delicately balanced with very high species diversity. And so many organisms living in those ecosystems are very sensitive to the environment. And now one of our examples here is going to be pink shrimp. Pink shrimp are pretty cool. So we basically can only find them in the Everglades off the coast of Florida, specifically living in estuaries where we're going to find mangrove trees. And there's a reason for that. So pink shrimp are born in the ocean, and those little larvae are going to eat algae and other small organisms. And so they're going to eat algae that's pretty close to the surface. And so once they're born, and those eggs obviously went to the bottom of the ocean, now we're floating around and we're making our way closer to the surface where we're going to find a lot of algae. As they mature, they are going to move into that protective mangrove estuary because that's where they can find food and shelter and not be eaten by fish because they have all those roots to hide in. that kind of thing. Once the pink shrimp matures a little bit further and we're more in a juvenile stage, they're going to start heading back into the open ocean to complete their development, reproduce, and start the cycle all over again. Well, what if everybody wants beachfront property in Florida and we can just cut down some mangrove trees and, then it can have a beautiful home right on the beach? Well, that's not necessarily a good thing, because that's going to disturb the habitat for the shrimp. That's going to disturb the habitat for the fish that eat the shrimp. And it's probably going to allow the algae to become overgrown. And even if you look at it outside of like the interactions between the species, you also have the trees are no longer there, so they're not going to hold and protect that habitat, and we're going to allow for way more flooding in the case of a hurricane, etc. So here is a quick understanding check question. So which of the following best describes a community? A, the American bison living in Yellowstone Park. B, the organisms in an oak maple forest. Or C, pink shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico. So if you recall what a community is, that's more than one species living in an area. So which one of these answer choices looks at more than one kind of species? The only one there is going to be B, so the correct answer is B. A second concept check question for this portion in our lecture is, it is widely believed that humans have approached or even exceeded their carrying capacity on Earth. Which of the following is likely to happen if the human population continues to increase? So, answer choice A is competition for resources will decrease. B, competition for resources will remain the same. Or C, competition for resources will increase. Well, if we have too many humans on this planet, there's not going to be enough food. So, the correct answer is C, competition for resources will increase. Next up is section 5.3. Organisms interact in their environment in different ways, and competition for resources includes food, nutrients, living space, and there's two main ways that competition happens. You either have interspecific competition, which involves one species interacting with another species, so across species interactions and competition. Intra-specific competition is competition within a species. And so when we look at interspecific competition, you're going to see more competition when there's a niche overlap. And so if we remember from chapter 4, a niche is that place where you are thriving, that has all the things you need to live within your environment. And so what happens with interspecific competition? Well, species A and B, and here we have a chipmunk, a ground squirrel, and an Ebert squirrel. So if we look at species A and B, the chipmunk and the ground squirrel have a large portion overlapping in their niches. And species C, he's kind of over there, just barely overlapping, just a little bit with our ground squirrel. And so if we use all the resources in this middle area, what are we going to do? We're going to actually see species A shift to the left, species B shift to the right, so that each of these species, whenever they're living in the same environment and living together with one another, they're actually going to move and become more individualized in their species. So you'll see B shift to the right, but not overlap with C except for just a little bit, and A shift to the left. Otherwise, both species A and B are going to be more likely to die out because they have too much competition for the area. Intraspecific competition is obviously within a species, so their niches overlap completely, and this often leads to some really great YouTube videos or Animal Planet shows where you've got animals fighting with one another or displaying all sorts of different kinds of crazy behaviors. One of the most common reasons why you would see intraspecific competition would be competition for mates. Another one would be competition for territory. And animals are not afraid to fight for the area that they believe is theirs. So predation is a term that we need to define for this chapter, and so that is where one organism eats another. There are two different types of predators. You have specialists and you have generalists. So specialists are only going to eat certain things, whereas a generalist, much like a hawk, is basically going to eat basically anything that's small and can fit in their mouth. Whether that's a small cat or a mouse or a rat or a bunny, it doesn't really matter. So the next term that we're going to look at is keystone species. And keystone species are really cool. So a keystone species is a predator which has a very large effect on the population dynamics of other species within a community. And so here we have the sea otter. The sea otter, the fish that live in the kelp beds, and the sea urchins, they're all going to live kind of in the same environment. But as the sea otter eats sea urchins, that actually creates areas for kelp to grow, and then that kelp can then provide food for fish. So if the sea urchin population gets out of control because we don't have any sea otters, our fish are going to die off because they don't have food. And because the sea otter not only is helping himself and interacting with the sea urchin, but interacting indirectly with the kelp and the fish, it's going to be a keystone species because it has a very big effect on the environment. So the next type of big relationship that you're going to see between plants or animals or two different species interacting with one another is going to be parasitism. And this is where one benefits at the other organism's expense. These are going to be long-term interactions, and so predator-prey relationships don't really apply in parasitism. So parasites could be fleas or ticks on your dog or bed bugs on you. They could also be between plants, and one of the ways that we are going to look at that is through mistletoe. So no kissing under the mistletoe at Christmas time. Mistletoe grows on trees, and it actually is a parasite. It actually gets into the tree branches and takes the water and the sugar that's supposed to be, for the tree and for its growth and stuff. And instead, the mistletoe is going to take that away. If you get a lot of mistletoe in a tree, it can eventually kill it if it's there for a long time. So if you have mistletoe in your trees, you should definitely get rid of it. The human digestive system includes bacteria, which produces B vitamins. Which of the following terms best describes the relationship between humans and their normal digestive bacteria? So let's see if you can figure out which kind of interaction that we've talked about so far would be an example of a human digestive system with bacteria. Is that going to be A, predation, B, mutualism, C, commensalism, or D, parasitism? Well, the correct answer here is going to be B, mutualism, because humans get the vitamins. They also provide a home for the bacteria, so the bacteria gets a home, and it also gets all of its nutrients from the food the human is intaking, but neither is hurt in any way. Our second conceptual question for this section is going to be, elephants are large herbivores which push down trees to eat the leaves. This destroys the trees and opens up the environment to allow patches of grass to grow. Without elephants, the grassy savanna would revert back to woodlands. And which term would best describe elephants in this stance? So, what are we looking at with the elephants? Are they going to be A, mutualists, B, parasites, C, commensalists, or D, keystone species? Well, in this case, the elephant, we're looking at how it interacts with the trees, and because of that, then you have your grassy savanna. So because it's not a direct interaction with that grassy savanna, the elephant will be your keystone species. D is the correct answer. Section 5.4, energy flows through ecosystems. Energy on Earth is all coming from sunlight in some form or another. And it's kind of cool. So in science, you have a couple of major laws. One of them that's in physics and chemistry and biology and all those kind of things is that nothing can be created or destroyed. It can be changed, it can be transferred, but it can't be created or destroyed. So the sun is beaming light into our planet, and that light is then going to be absorbed and changed by our primary producers, and these are things that are going to do photosynthesis. So plants and trees and algae, all those kind of things are going to be considered photoautotrophs. So photo means light, auto means self, and troph means to feed or to eat. And so a photoautotroph is able to feed itself through the process of photosynthesis. So they're able to take that energy, they're going to change it, and they're going to make, typically the main type of energy we see on this planet is going to be ATP. And ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and that's the kind of energy your body uses when you eat nutritious foods, whether that is plants or animals, because we are obviously omnivores. But cows, let's use that as an example. The cows are going to eat the plants. Something is going to eat the cow, whether that is a consumer, a detritivore, or a decomposer. And a detritivore is very similar to a decomposer. They are going to typically be eating detritus or dead stuff. The dead animal, so buzzards eating roadkill, detritivore. Or the dead cow once it dies. Once that happens, we eventually get to where everything that had eaten it at some point on the time is going to die. Eventually, bugs and bacteria and those kind of things are going to come in, and they're going to decompose that. We're going to move it back into the earth, and then it's going to come back. That energy is going to come back in the form of plants or animals and nutrients for them. So the main way that energy is lost is through heat. So if you're running and you're sweating, obviously, that's going to be where you're losing heat to the environment. Other things do that as well, even plants. So feeding relationships in an ecosystem. Your food chain is, we've learned about this whenever you were really young, I'm sure, is going to be a map of different feeding relationships. And so different levels of a food chain are described as being a trophic level. So the bottom part of your food chain is always going to be your producer. That's typically going to be your plants or algae that are going to be doing photosynthesis. Then your primary consumers are going to be the things that eat the producers. Secondary consumers eat your primary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat your secondary consumers, and then sometimes, but not always, you're going to have quaternary consumers. And those are going to be your apex predators that are sitting at the top of your ecosystem. Occasionally, if you don't have those, your food chain can actually stop with a tertiary consumer. So a detritivore is a scavenging organism. They're really important in getting rid of roadkill and other dead animals. So here's a picture so you can kind of see how energy will flow through an ecosystem. All the things here are important. Fungi is acting as a decomposer. The blowfly larvae and the carrion beetle and the raven are all going to be detritivores. Roundworms and earthworms and bacteria, that's all going to be part of the decomposers as well. Taking that energy form in the form of a dead animal and moving it back into the environment. And so here's a picture of a food web. And you can see it's a lot more complicated than the simple ones we looked at earlier in the day. They can be even more complicated than that one. So 5.4 is next, and in this one we're actually going to be looking at how energy transfer moves through the food chain. So question check number, I don't know, I think this is number 5 for this chapter. Which term best describes the emperor penguin in the food chain? Is it a producer, A, a quaternary consumer, B, a herbivore, C, a tertiary consumer, or a primary consumer? Well, let's see. The correct answer here for the emperor penguin is definitely not a producer or a herbivore, because we didn't learn anything about herbivores, but it doesn't eat plants, so that one's a give-be. The primary consumer in this food web is going to be krill. Secondary would be your squid. So the emperor penguin would be your tertiary consumer because it's second to the top. So yet again, here's a couple of videos I do want you to watch. They are on your Blackboard website. And then one of the last things that we're going to look at for the day is going to be behavioral ecology. And this is a really, really fun part of the look at is going to be social interactions and how they can enhance fitness. So fitness is not going to the gym and working out and becoming stronger and faster and those kind of things. In biology, fitness is different. Fitness means your ability to survive and reproduce. And how do we enhance that? Well, working together as a group in a flock of birds, you're going to have more people available to take care of young. A lot of times you can see that with elephants. Elephants are really good at making sure to take care of their young and raise them together. A pride of lions, kind of the same thing. Protection and defense, that's definitely a bird thing. But all sorts of animals will have different kinds of interactions where you're going to help with protection and defense. And then third, of course, is going to be more beaks or feet or mouths available for helping to obtain resources. That third one there is kind of a double-edged sword in that you have more people available to get resources, but you also need more resources. And so there's definitely limits on that. Care of young is kind of one of those really cool ones. Obviously, we have a creepy little mouse here feeding its babies, but have you ever seen on like a news story or like at a zoo where a dog or something like nursed a tiger cub, those kind of things? It can definitely just be like an innate behavior that's going to be animals can be born with. It can actually be determined by genetics. There are all sorts of animals. So mammals tend to take care of their young quite a bit. Birds, maybe not as much. And then you have species that are not going to take care of their young at all. And so that's definitely going to be a genetic kind of thing. Herd effects are helpful in defense. So the herd effect means a flock of birds is more safe because they have more eyes to detect predators. And then finally, obtaining resources. An easy one to look at here is group predators. So like a pack of wolves, they're going to hunt together to kill animals that are much larger than themselves. So a pack of wolves might take down a bison or an elk or a deer, and then they're going to be able to eat very well that night. So there are some disadvantages to living in a social group. One of those is increased interest-specific competition, and that means increased competition within that species, in that group living together. And then you're going to see more disease happen whenever you have a social group happening. I know my niece just went to school last week on Wednesday, first day of school. On Friday, was already running a fever because disease spreads when you put all of those germy little kids together in one room at the same time. So an important part of living together in a social group is communicating with those groups, and communication can be crazy and kind of fun. So communication methods can be visual. Think a peacock's feathers, trying to be the biggest and the prettiest for all the ladies. Auditory, obviously bird sounds and songs and dog barking, all those kind of things. tactile, think monkeys picking the fleas off of their friends and family there in their group, or even chemical. And so pheromones play a big deal. And most of the time, pheromones is going to be either marking your territory or, helping to attract a mate. So social groups often establish social orders. And with this, you're going to have that alpha omega kind of dominance a lot of times. And so dominance helps to prevent and minimize conflict and competition and allows each person or animal to have its place. So wolves and chickens have a alpha wolf or an alpha chicken, alpha hen, I guess you would say, that is going to be typically a female. I like female-led societies because we live in a male-dominated one, so I like to look at and make examples of female-led societies. So typically in wolves and chickens, the alpha is going to be a female. It's going to be the most dominant individual, and then you're going to have their beta, and then eventually way down the line, you're going to have the omega. And the alpha's responsibility is to regulate how the other individuals eat and have access to food and mates. Typically, the alpha, beta, those at the top of the pack or flock are going to get more to eat, and they're going to be the ones that are going to have more babies. While the omega is typically not going to be reproducing at all and eating much less. This actually is like a good thing for their wolf pack or the chicken flock, because the new babies that you have are going to typically exhibit the strength of those instead of having the weaknesses of the omegas in the pack.